Good morning, friends. Welcome to our Godly Play story today. The name of our story is The Great Family, and we have been going through God's story starting in Genesis from creation. And last week we talked about the great flood and the ark and God's promise to never flood the earth again and create a new earth through one family, Noah and his family. And today, our story is the Great Family. And the desert is so important to the people of God. So we have to have a desert in our classroom. Now, we couldn't have the whole desert in our classroom, but we had to have a piece. The desert is a dangerous place. It is very hot in the desert. And not a lot grows because there's very little water. And people that live or go to the desert have to wear special clothing because the sun will burn their skin. And it's very windy in the desert and cold at night. And when the wind blows, it changes the shape of the desert. So it's very easy to get lost. People do not go to the desert unless they have to. The desert is a wild and dangerous place. After the flood, the people and animals of the earth went out make a life. And they built towns and cities, and they often would build them near rivers where there was water. And there was a great city of that time called Ur, and another city named Haran. Now the people in Ur believed that there were many gods. They believed that there was a God for the sun, and a God for the moon, and a God for the flowers, and a God for rocks. The earth was alive with gods. But there was one family, a man named Abram and his wife, Sarai. And they believed that there was one God who was in all places at all times. They didn't know this to be true yet, but that's what they believed. When it came time for Abram and Sarai to move, they walked along the Euphrates River where they could get water to the town of Haran. And God went with them. They knew that God was also in Haran. And Abram would go out and pray. And God would come so close to Abram. And Abram would come so close to God that Abram knew what God wanted him to do. And Abram told Sarai that God had told him to move towards Canaan. That would have been scary. They had lots of animals and family and helpers, and it meant going across the desert, away from the water that would lead them and guide them. But Abram and Sarai did what God said, and they went out into the desert towards Canaan with their family, his brother Lot, their animals, their helpers. And they started on the long journey. They first made a place in the town of Shechem. And when Abram would go out to pray, he knew that God was there with him. And so he would build an altar in Shechem to say God was here. As they kept going across the desert with all of their animals and family and helpers, they came to another place called Bethel. And Abram would go out to pray, and he knew that God was in Bethel too. So he built an altar. And Abram began to know that God was with him in all places, in all times. When they finally arrived to their home, Hebron, near the oaks of Mamre, they pitched their home, their tents, a place to live. And one night, as Abram went out and looked up at the stars in the sky, and that night God came so close to Abram, and Abram came so close to God that Abram heard God tell him that he would be a father of many nations. And Abram laughed because Abram was so old, older than probably your grandparents. But God told Abram that he would have as many children as grains of sand and as many children as stars in the sky. That was impossible, thought Abraham. And God did change his name to Abraham. And he said to change Sarai's name to Sarah. Abraham went back to Sarah and told her what God had said, and they both laughed because Sarah was very old too. Old like your grandparents, or older. Now Abraham and Sarah laughed together. One day, 3 strangers came to see Abraham and Sarah. And Sarah and Abraham took them into their tent, and Sarah made bread with 3 parts of flour. That was a lot. And they talked, and the 3 strangers said to them, "Sarah, you are going to have a baby boy." And Sarah laughed again because she thought, I am so old. I am not going to have a baby. But guess what? Sarah had a baby, and they named him Isaac. Because in their language, Isaac means laughter. Sarah grew older and tired and full of years. And Sarah died. And Isaac and Abraham buried Sarah in a cave near the oaks of Mamre. Now Isaac knew, and Abraham knew, there was one thing left to do, and that was to find Isaac a wife so they could make a family. So Abraham sent his helper back where they came from, through Bethel and Shechem, to find a wife for Isaac. And his helper came upon a place to get water for his animals and himself. And there was a woman there named Rebekah. And Rebekah gave him water, gave his animals water, and she was so courageous as well as kind. She invited the man back with her family to have dinner. And he went and told Rebekah all about the great family that he had come from. And Rebekah decided that she wanted to be part of that great family. So Rebekah and the helper went all the way back to Hebron by the oak trees of Mamre. And when Isaac saw her coming, he ran to her, and they were married. Abraham was old and full of years and very tired, and Abraham died. And Isaac and Rebekah buried him next to Sarah in a cave near the oak trees of Mamre. Now Isaac and Sarah had babies, and their babies had babies, and their babies had babies. And this went on for many, many, many years until your grandparents had babies and your mom and dad had babies. And now you are part of the great family, as many grains in the sand and as many stars in the sky are the people in this great family. I wonder which part of this story you liked best. I wonder what part of this story you thought was most important. I wonder what part of this story is about you, or where are you in this story? Let's pray together. Dear Jesus, we thank you for this story that is in your word. We thank you that we are part of your family. It's so amazing that each of us has our own families, and yet we are part of the same family, your family. You have called us to be part of your family. And your family is so big, and there's room for so many more. We love you, God. Help us as we go into school or stay home for school, as we are with our families. Help us, Lord, to be a reflection of who we are, part of your family. We love you, God. Amen. Have a good week, friends, especially those of you starting school. I've been praying for you. Bye-bye.
God's story, God's promise to Abraham. So part of God's story is about a promise God made to Abraham, and it begins like this. Once there was a guy named Abraham. He had a wife, Sarah. They didn't think they could have any kids, which was a major disappointment because they really wanted a family. But little did Abraham know that God had a very special plan for him. When Abraham was 75 years old, God promised to give him kids, and one day God would send the rescuer through his family. All God asked was that Abraham and Sarah leave their home first and follow him. Now, they had a tough choice to make: leave all their friends and trust God, or stay comfortable. This was not easy. See, Abraham really wanted kids, but was already pretty old. Sarah was getting up there too. Not to mention, she had never been able to get pregnant. So if Abraham and Sarah were going to leave their home and trust in God's promise, they had to believe that God would do something that seemed impossible. The good news is, they decided to trust that God would keep his promise. That's always the right choice. So Abraham and Sarah moved from their home to a land called Canaan. Right away, God reminded Abraham of his promise. He said, "I will make your children like the dust of the earth." Can specks of dust be counted? If they can, then your children can be counted. This was God's funny way of telling Abraham he would have a lot of kids, because nobody can count every piece of dust. Well, this promise seemed great, but after a while, Abraham and Sarah still had no kids, let alone as many as the pieces of dust. Now, they were really old. Sometimes God doesn't remind us of his promises because he wants us to learn to trust him. But God took Abraham outside at night and told him to look at the stars. He reminded Abraham that he would give him that many kids. So Abraham decided to keep believing God. He and Sarah waited again. After more years, he got impatient. This time, God told Abraham, by next year, Sarah will have a son. But by now, Abraham was 99 years old. He and Sarah had both given up on having kids and God's promise. In fact, when Abraham told Sarah what God said, she laughed. It's probably not a good idea to laugh at God's promises, but Sarah was tired of waiting and had stopped trusting. The great thing is, even if we think it's impossible, God really does keep his promises. And just like God promised, Sarah got pregnant the next year after Abraham's 100th birthday. When her son was born, she named him Isaac, which means laughter. Sarah said, God has given laughter to me. Everybody who hears about this will laugh with me. And think about it. A really old lady having a baby is pretty funny. God kept his promise to give Abraham and Sarah a son. Even though they didn't think it was possible, it was easy for God because he can do anything, including giving old people babies. And remember how God was going to give Abraham as many children as the stars in the sky? Well, Isaac grew up and had children who had more children who had more children. This kept going and going and going. And guess who eventually was born in Abraham's line? The rescuer himself, God's son, Jesus. All because Abraham followed God and trusted God to keep his promise. And that's the story of God's promise to Abraham. So in case you missed it, here's the quick version. Abraham and Sarah were old. God promised to give Abraham kids. Abraham and Sarah waited. They got impatient. God reminded them he keeps his promises. Abraham and Sarah waited more. They got impatient again. God told them Sarah would have a baby. Sarah laughed. She had a baby. Jesus was eventually born into their family. God always keeps his promises. And that's a part of God's story.